When you picture a citizen of the Roman Empire, you probably imagine someone wearing a white toga, sandals, and maybe some kind of laurel on their head.
Wait, your biggest stickers? Here's of this.
But despite what we see in movies like Gladiator and television shows like Rome, most Romans didn't really dress that way. Today, we're going to take a look at what the ancient Romans actually wore. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other historical fashions you would like to hear about. Okay, are you ready for some Roman fashion? Toga! Toga! Romans did wear togas. Movies didn't make that part up. In fact, they were common enough that the Romans sometimes referred to themselves as togati, or people of the toga, which sounds like a 70s yacht rock album. But togas weren't casual wear. They were status symbols worn on special occasions and reserved mostly for wealthy men. Basically, the ancient Roman equivalent of a nice suit or tuxedo. Interestingly, their status as formal wear is one of the main reasons modern people think all Romans wore them. Since togas feature prominently in contemporary statues and paintings, they seem like they were everywhere. But it was usually only the wealthiest who could afford a sculpture or painting of themselves in the first place. I've got some money to blow. Maybe I'll get a sculpture of myself. There were several toga varieties. The classic white toga, or toga virilis, was worn by young men to signal their passage into adulthood. Politicians wore a bleached version of the white toga called the toga candida. In times of mourning, Romans wore togas of dark wool. The rarest was the toga picta, dyed purple with gold embroidery. This was reserved for generals celebrating a triumph. Togas were a status symbol mostly because they required lots of fabric. This fabric, made from wool, was expensive and time-consuming to produce, and like most of the best textiles, was only affordable to the wealthy. A toga was cut from a single piece of wool cloth in a semicircular shape, and the longest any toga could be was about 18 feet. Like tying some of today's more elaborate neckties, wrapping a toga was a complicated process. According to the Oxford Classical Dictionary, one corner would be placed before the feet, and the straight edge was taken up and over the left shoulder. It was then pulled across the back and under or over the right arm, across the chest, and over the left shoulder again. The second corner was left hanging behind the knees, and the curved edge became the garment's hem. In addition to the toga itself, how a toga was worn was also something of a status symbol. A well-fitted and well-maintained toga was a marker of wealth and sophistication. And since it's very difficult to wrap a toga around one's body alone, trust me on that one, wealthy Romans came to value slaves who had toga wrapping skills. In ancient Roman times, clothing dyes had to come from natural sources. The dye used to make a classic purple tunic worn by a Roman emperor, for example, was extracted from the glands of a variety of sea snail called the Hexaplex trunculus, which you and your friends might call the banded dye murex, which is native to the Mediterranean. These sea snails live in deeper water and were harvested via traps suspended from floats. Once enough shells were collected, they would be left in the sun to putrefy and were then crushed, leaving a distinct purple liquid. The name for this shade of purple was Tyrian purple. It was also sometimes known as royal purple or imperial purple. The Romans did not come up with the whole sea snail crushing thing. They actually learned the technique from one of their earliest rivals, the Phoenician civilization. The Phoenicians were seafaring and trading people based in the eastern Mediterranean. They were so heavily associated with purple dye, the name Phoenician is actually a Greek word for them that literally means purple. It's estimated that roughly 10,000 shells were needed to produce just 1 gram of purple dye. That was a tough time to be a sea snail. The dye manufacturing site at the ancient city of Sidon in modern-day Lebanon even included a waste dump of crushed shells about 40 meters high. The female counterpart to the toga was known as the stola. This was a long, sleeveless garment that was sometimes hung from the shoulders with straps. If you want an easy point of reference for what that looked like, we point you to the Statue of Liberty, who is depicted in a stola. Stolas were worn only by married women, and the garment was considered a signifier of their status. Unlike togas, which came in numerous varieties that denoted social status, stolas were relatively simple, as women didn't have a wide spectrum of career opportunities. Instead, Roman women used jewelry and elaborate hairstyles to advertise their wealth and social rank. But Roman women took their clothes seriously. In 195 BC, they even marched in protest of the Lex Sophia, a series of laws enacted in response to the financial issues of the Second Punic War that restricted extravagant spending on fashion. The clothing item of choice for unmarried women was a simple tunic. The tunic was also the primary garment for lower-class men, as well as girls and boys. Silk originated in China as early as 6000 BCE and probably no later than 3000 BCE. Chinese merchants gradually spread the luxury fabric across Asia via the famous Silk Road, and later it made it into the Middle East and eventually the Mediterranean. The Greeks and Romans were aware of the existence of China and its silk as early as the 4th century BCE. In their writings, they even referred to China as Ceres, literally the kingdom of silk. Silk made its way into Roman wardrobes by the 1st century BCE. There are even surviving references to it in the writings of Augustan poets like Ovid and Horace. The historian Suetonius recorded the fact that the Emperor Caligula was fond of wearing silk. Emperor Marcus Aurelius sent the first envoy to China in 166 CE, the first known instance of direct contact between the two civilizations. That really kicked things off, because by 380 CE, the soldier and historian Marcellinus Ammianus observed that the use of silk, which was once confined to the nobility, has now spread to all classes without distinction, even to the lowest. Ancient Roman women had their own version of activewear that was relatively similar to the modern bikini. The top was called a stropium, or breastband, and it was often made of linen, and the bottom was called a subligaculum. Men, on the other hand, wore a perizoma, or more commonly known as the loincloth. However, despite their similarity to swimwear, these outfits were actually worn for athletics, not for swimming. For example, a Roman woman might wear such an outfit to participate in sports like running, discus throwing, the long jump, or an ancient ball game that was one of the earliest forms of team sports. Archaeologists have recovered some of these garments. One thong-like subligaculum is on display at the Museum of London. A detailed mosaic showing these garments can be seen at the Villa Romana del Casale, near Piazza Armerina in Sicily. While it's likely that many Romans simply went commando, we do know that at least some Romans wore undergarments. For the most part, Roman undergarments were similar to what they wore when playing sports. Roman men and women both sometimes wore a subligaculum, also called the sublicer, underneath their tunics. Roman women also wore the stropia, or an alternative support garment called a mamillare. Roman women also sometimes wore an undertoga, like a slip, called a suparus or suparum. Most of these garments would have been made from either linen or leather. Since nudity was somewhat taboo in their society, people from the lowest social strata, such as peasants or gladiators, were often depicted wearing nothing but their underwear. Another thing the movies got right is that the Romans did wear the sandals they're usually depicted in.
Hey, show!
But in reality, those sandals were mainly worn indoors. When venturing outside, Romans often wore shoes that fully covered their feet. These were often made out of leather and were available to all classes, although wealthier Romans did wear more expensive shoes. Some things don't change. Unlike today, Roman shoes appear to have been styled as unisex garments. Roman soldiers, as you might expect, had an even more durable footwear option available to them, called the caligae. These were open-toed boots made with hobnails that gave extra traction. The Roman Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his nickname Caligula, or Little Boots, received his nickname from the small boots made for him to wear on his father Germanicus's campaigns as a boy. Cute story, if Caligula wasn't synonymous with depraved tyranny. If you've ever wondered how people wash their clothes before soap or Tide Pods were widely available, then here's a handy tip. They wash them in urine. You see, like modern cleaning products, urine is chock full of ammonia, a natural solvent that breaks up dirt and grease. In fact, even after soap became popular in Europe for personal hygiene, urine was still used to get rid of tough stains. Romans collected their urine in vessels that lined the streets. Pedestrians would simply stop and relieve themselves and continue with their day. When full, these urine jugs would go to a phulonica, or laundry. Once the urine was poured over dirty clothes, a Roman laundry worker would stand in the tub and stomp on it. That's a tough job, but it could be shittier. Sandals are a very sensible choice for the Mediterranean climate during the warmer months of the year. But the Romans conquered plenty of regions with less hospitable climates. Places in the empire like Great Britain and parts of southern Scandinavia get extremely cold, and in all fairness, Rome gets chilly too. So when Romans needed a cold weather option, they took socks knitted with a divided toe and wore them with sandals. Divers excavating an underwater Roman fort near the River Tees near Darlington in the UK discovered a razor handle carved to resemble a human foot, and it's clearly wearing sandals with socks. The look also appeared on a bronze statue discovered in Southwark. This proves that it's not just your dad that thinks socks and sandals are practical and fashionable. Some things never go out of style. So what do you think? When in Rome, how would you dress? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.